Richard Brown, a seasoned astronaut with a career that spanned over 2 decades, had always been fascinated by the stars. From his early days as a cadet at NASA to his numerous missions that took him beyond the stratosphere, space was not just a job for him. It was a calling. He had seen the Earth from above, watched as the blue planet spun like a fragile marble in the vastness of the cosmos, and felt the rush of zero gravity as he floated in the depths of space. But everything changed during his last mission, a mission that would haunt him long after he returned home. The mission to the distant planet Zeta 3 had initially promised to be a routine exploration, one that would add another line to the proud history of human space travel. However, during a routine EVA, extravehicular activity, Richard and his crew encountered something they could not have anticipated. As Richard drifted away from the spacecraft, adjusting his instruments to collect soil samples, he noticed a shimmer of light in the distance. It caught his eye, a flicker that danced among the rocky terrain of Zeta 3. Intrigued, he maneuvered closer, his heart racing with a mix of excitement and apprehension. What he found was beyond his wildest imagination. Strange green creatures emerged from the shadows, their elongated limbs and large, luminescent eyes gazing at him with a curiosity that felt eerily human. They communicated not through words, but through a series of clicks and flashes that seemed to resonate with Richard's very being. In those moments, time stood still. The profound connection he felt with these beings was something he had never experienced before. It transcended the physical barriers of language and culture. But reality crashed down when he reported the incident to his fellow astronauts. Instead of the validation he craved, Richard was met with laughter and disbelief. "Aliens? Come on, Rich. You must have hit your head out there," one of his colleagues joked. Another chimed in, "Next, you'll tell us you found the Loch Ness Monster." Their dismissive attitudes stung, and Richard felt isolated in his experience. It was as if he had witnessed a miracle, only to be told it was a mere trick of the light. Returning to Earth was a bittersweet moment for Richard. He was a hero in the eyes of the world, celebrated for his accomplishments and bravery. Yet, inside, he felt like a pariah, carrying a burden that no one else could understand. Unable to shake the memory of the aliens, he began to withdraw from his colleagues and friends. Each time he attempted to discuss his experience, he was met with ridicule, which only reinforced his decision to keep silent. Months turned into years, and the shadows of Zeta 3 loomed over him like an ever-present specter. Richard became increasingly distracted, unable to focus on the mundane tasks of daily life. Work became a struggle. He could no longer navigate the complexities of mission protocols or engage in meetings with the same enthusiasm. He decided to retire early, at a young age, leaving behind a promising career that had once filled him with pride. In the solitude of his farmhouse, nestled among rolling hills and quiet fields, Richard sought solace. The stillness of nature provided a temporary reprieve from the chaos in his mind. He filled his days tending to the land, planting vegetables, and watching the clouds drift lazily across the sky. Yet, even in this serene environment, thoughts of the green creatures would occasionally bubble to the surface, sending him spiraling back into doubt. He attempted to rationalize his experience, convincing himself that the aliens were nothing more than a figment of his imagination. Perhaps the stress of the mission had led him to hallucinate. After all, he had been isolated in a cramped spacecraft for weeks, surrounded by the vacuum of space. The thought of being branded as crazy was unbearable, so he tucked the memory deep into the recesses of his mind. As the years rolled by, Richard became a recluse, living alone in his farmhouse, far removed from the bustling world he once knew. He embraced the quiet life, focusing on farming and the simple pleasures of nature. Yet, every so often, the whisper of the aliens would echo in his mind, like a distant melody teasing his consciousness. But instead of confronting those thoughts, he chose to bury them deeper, convincing himself they were long forgotten. One crisp autumn evening, while sitting on his porch with a cup of tea, Richard found himself staring at the stars. The night sky glittered like diamonds against a velvet backdrop, and for a moment he felt a pang of nostalgia for the adventures he had left behind. The memories of his journeys to distant planets resurfaced, and he could almost hear the laughter of his crewmates. But the thought of the green creatures brought a knot to his stomach, a reminder of the truth he had tried so hard to ignore. At that moment, a shooting star streaked across the sky, and Richard closed his eyes, wishing for peace. Perhaps it was time to let go of the past, to accept that what he had seen was merely a dream. But deep down, in the quiet corners of his heart, a flicker of hope remained. What if the aliens were real? What if they were still out there, waiting for him to remember? As the years faded into memory, Richard Brown stood at a crossroads, a man caught between two worlds, the earthly life he had built and the cosmic truth he could not fully embrace. Would he ever truly escape the shadows of Zeta 3? Or were the aliens destined to haunt him, their mystery entwined with his very existence? Only time would tell. But Richard had a feeling that the answers were closer than he imagined, just waiting for the right moment to reveal themselves. On a crisp autumn morning, the air was filled with the earthy scent of fallen leaves, and Richard Brown sat on his porch, enjoying the tranquility of his solitary life. It had been 10 years since he had left behind the chaos of space travel, 10 years filled with the rhythms of farm life and the occasional echo of distant stars. The solitude had become a comforting blanket, shielding him from the judgments of the world and allowing him to cultivate a routine that felt safe. Little did he know that this day would change everything. As he sipped his tea, a rumble of engines broke the stillness. Richard squinted into the distance, watching as a United States military vehicle approached his farmhouse. The sight of the dark green truck sent a wave of unease through him. He had distanced himself from the government and its machinations, preferring the simplicity of his rural existence. As the vehicle came to a stop, Richard's heart raced. A soldier in full gear emerged, his demeanor serious yet respectful. "Richard Brown," the soldier called out, striding toward him. "Yes, that's me," Richard replied, rising from his chair with cautious curiosity. "We need your help," the soldier said, his voice steady but urgent. Richard's brow furrowed in confusion. "My help? For what?" The soldier gestured toward the military vehicle. "If you would please come with me, sir. It's urgent." Reluctantly, Richard followed, his mind racing with questions. What could the military possibly want with him? Was there an emergency? As he climbed into the vehicle, he felt a surge of apprehension mixed with an inexplicable curiosity. The soldier did not elaborate, and as they drove toward the military base, Richard could only wonder about the nature of the request. Upon arriving at the base, the atmosphere was charged with energy. Soldiers moved purposefully, and the air hummed with a sense of impending action. Richard was led through security checkpoints and past rows of military personnel who seemed to regard him with a mix of respect and urgency. Finally, he was taken to a conference room where a group of high-ranking officers gathered, their expressions serious. A general stepped forward, his eyes locking onto Richard's with an intensity that made him feel both important and apprehensive. "Mr. Brown," the general began, "we appreciate your cooperation today. I believe you understand the gravity of this situation." Richard nodded, his heart pounding in his chest. "I'm still not clear on what this is about. Why am I here?" "Did you see green creatures on a mission 11 years ago?" the general asked directly, cutting through the pleasantries. Richard felt the blood drain from his face, shock coursing through him. What? No, I just imagined it. They weren't real. How do you know about that? The general leaned closer, his expression unwavering. Your mission colleagues reported your experience. You were not alone in witnessing those beings. We have reason to believe that those creatures were connected to something significant. Richard's mind raced. Could it be true? Had others seen the aliens as well? What are you talking about? He asked, struggling to keep his composure. The general paused, choosing his words carefully. A month ago, we sent a team back to Zeta 3. They found something remarkable. Valuable stone mines. These stones can provide us with an unlimited energy source, something that could change the course of humanity. But we need someone who understands the terrain and the creatures that inhabit it. That's why we're asking for your help. You were one of our most successful astronauts, and your experience could be invaluable. Richard's mind whirled. The thought of returning to Zeta 3 was both exhilarating and terrifying. The memories of the green creatures flooded back, and he felt a mix of fear and curiosity. He had buried that experience for so long, convinced it was merely a figment of his imagination. But now, faced with the possibility of uncovering a truth that could alter the future, he felt an undeniable pull toward the unknown. I don't know if I can do this, Richard replied, hesitating. What if I'm wrong? What if those creatures were just in my head? The general's expression softened slightly. We understand your concerns, but the stakes are higher than personal doubts. This could secure energy for our country and the world. Think of the potential impact, Richard. We can't do this without you. Richard's resolve began to waver as he contemplated the implications of this mission. For years, he had sought solace in the isolation of his farmhouse, trying to forget the past. But now, faced with the prospect of making a difference, a spark of purpose ignited within him. Perhaps this was his chance to confront the very thing that had haunted him for so long. With a deep breath, Richard straightened his posture and met the general's gaze. All right, I'll do it. For my country. For the potential of what we might discover. A look of relief washed over the general's face, and he extended his hand. Thank you, Richard. Your courage is commendable. We will begin preparations immediately. As they shook hands, Richard felt the weight of his decision settle upon him. He was stepping back into a world he had long abandoned, a world filled with the potential for wonder and danger. With each passing moment, he was reminded of the green creatures, the connection he had felt, and the mystery that still surrounded them. As the reality of the mission began to take shape, Richard couldn't shake the feeling that this was not just a journey back to Zeta 3, but also a journey into the depths of his own mind. Would he find answers to the questions that had haunted him for a decade? Or would he uncover something far more terrifying than he had ever imagined? The road ahead was uncertain, but Richard Brown was ready to embrace whatever awaited him among the stars once more. The journey back to Zeta 3 felt like a surreal dream to Richard Brown. After years of distancing himself from the memories of his past, he was once again on a spacecraft, hurtling through the void, fueled by both trepidation and excitement. As the ship descended through the planet's atmosphere, the familiar vibrant greens and blues of Zeta 3 unfolded beneath them. Richard's heart raced, not just from the stunning beauty of the landscape, but also from the weight of the mission that lay ahead. When they landed, the air was thick with the hum of energy, and a sense of anticipation filled the crew as they prepared to disembark. Richard took a deep breath, steeling himself for the encounter that awaited him. As the hatch opened, The scents and sounds of Zeta-3 flooded his senses, an intoxicating mix of alien flora and the distant calls of creatures he could not yet see. Stepping onto the soil of Zeta-3 once more, Richard felt the ground tremble slightly beneath his feet, as if the planet itself was alive and aware of their presence. His instincts kicked in, and he remembered the warnings from his previous mission. Stay alert. Remain cautious. As they ventured into the dense vegetation, the atmosphere became thick with tension, and Richard felt the weight of history pressing down upon him. Within minutes, they encountered their first sighting, a group of the green creatures he had seen all those years ago. The sight of them sent a shiver down Richard's spine. They were strikingly similar to how he had remembered, tall and lithe, with emerald skin that shimmered in the dappled light of the canopy above. Their large, expressive eyes were filled with curiosity, and Richard couldn't help but feel a pang of connection as he observed them. As the soldiers moved closer, the aliens began to react, their expressions shifting from curiosity to alarm. Richard's heart raced as he instinctively raised his hand, signaling for the team to halt. But the soldiers were already on high alert, trained to respond with aggression. "We're here for the stones!" one shouted, raising his weapon. "Wait!" Richard shouted, desperation creeping into his voice. "They're intelligent! We need to communicate!" But it was too late. In a frenzy of fear and instinct, the soldiers opened fire. The forest erupted in chaos, the air filled with the cacophony of gunfire and the alien creatures' terrified cries. Richard watched in horror as the aliens fell, one by one, their vibrant forms collapsing to the ground. The very beings he had felt a connection with reduced to mere casualties in a conflict he had not wanted to engage in. Realization washed over him like cold water. They were here not just to harvest stones, but to wage a war. The mission had turned from exploration to extermination, and Richard felt as though he were watching the horror unfold from the outside. The weight of the world, his world, pressed heavily on him as he stood frozen, his heart in turmoil. In the aftermath of the chaos, as the dust settled and the last echoes of gunfire faded, Richard's team gathered the precious stones that lay embedded in the ground. He felt hollow, a shell of the man he had been only moments before. They had destroyed an entire race for the promise of energy, and he had allowed it to happen. But as they began to leave the clearing, a small movement caught Richard's eye. He turned, his heart leaping into his throat. Among the wreckage, a tiny green figure crouched, trembling in fear. A child alien, no taller than his knee, its large eyes wide and filled with tears. The sight struck Richard like a bolt of lightning. This was not just an alien. It was a child, innocent and terrified, embodying everything that had been lost in the brutality of the encounter. "Richard, let's move!" a soldier shouted, unaware of the small life that lay just a few feet away. In that moment, Richard faced a decision that would define his character and his future. He could ignore the child, walk away, and leave it to a fate that mirrored the rest of its kind. Or he could intervene, risking everything for a chance at redemption. His heart raced as he knelt down, inching closer to the small alien, who flinched at his approach. "Shh, it's okay," Richard whispered, his voice gentle, devoid of the chaos that had just erupted around them. "I'm not going to hurt you." The child's eyes widened in fear, and Richard realized how terrifying he must seem, a towering figure cloaked in the uniform of the soldiers who had just brought devastation to its home. He extended his hand slowly, palm up, offering a sign of peace. "I'm not like them. I want to help you." With a flicker of hesitation, the small alien began to inch closer, its fear mingled with a glimmer of hope. Richard could see the fear etched on its tiny face, and it broke his heart. He quickly scanned the area for any signs of his fellow soldiers before making a decision that would forever alter the course of his life. With swift movements, he scooped the child into his arms, cradling it close to his chest. "I won't let them hurt you," he promised softly, feeling the warmth of the small creature against him. As he turned to move back toward the spacecraft, adrenaline coursed through his veins. He knew he had to act quickly. Time was not on his side. Richard could hear the soldiers calling for him, their voices growing more urgent. He could not let them discover the child, not after everything that had happened. With the child pressed against him, Richard navigated through the dense foliage, his heart pounding with every step. This mission had taken a dark turn, but in this moment, he felt a flicker of hope. He would protect this innocent life, no matter the cost. Whatever had happened to the alien race, he could not allow the last remnant to suffer the same fate. As they reached the ship, Richard took one last glance back at the clearing where so many had fallen. He felt the weight of what he had done, and the burden of carrying this child into an uncertain future. He knew he had to make things right, not just for the alien child, but for himself. This would be the beginning of a new journey, one that would challenge his beliefs, his loyalties, and ultimately, his humanity. Upon his return to Earth, Richard Brown was met with accolades and applause. The grand ceremony held in his honor was a spectacle of lights, media, and flashing cameras, capturing the essence of what was supposed to be a triumphant moment. Dignitaries from all over the nation gathered to celebrate his bravery and commitment to his country, presenting him with awards that sparkled under the bright lights. As he stood at the podium, the weight of the small alien child hidden in his home felt like an anchor tethering him to a reality that was both surreal and horrifying. Richard delivered a speech filled with enthusiasm and pride, though his heart was not in it. He spoke of teamwork, exploration, and the bright future that lay ahead for humanity. His words polished and rehearsed. Yet, beneath the facade of a hero, guilt gnawed at him. The cheers from the crowd echoed in his ears, but all he could think about were the lives lost on Zeta 3 and the small alien child whose future now lay in the balance. After the ceremony, Richard handed over the precious stones to the scientists at the research facility, believing he was contributing to a breakthrough that could power the planet for generations. The stones, glowing with an otherworldly luminescence, were placed under the watchful eyes of leading experts who eagerly set about analyzing their properties. The excitement in the lab was palpable. Richard's heart sank deeper as he watched them handle the very artifacts that had precipitated such destruction. Days turned into weeks, and the world watched with bated breath as the scientists worked tirelessly. Richard tried to maintain a brave face, but he could not shake the feeling that something was off. The stones seemed to pulse with energy, and their glow intensified with each passing day. But it was the rumors, whispers among the scientists, that troubled him. He could sense that they were hiding something, their expressions strained and their conversations hushed. Finally, the day came when the scientists called Richard back to the lab for a special briefing. The air was thick with tension, and Richard's stomach twisted with anxiety as he entered the sterile room. The lead scientist, Dr. Emily Harris, stood at the front, her face pale and drawn. She motioned for Richard to sit, and he complied, feeling a sense of foreboding wash over him. "Richard," she began, her voice steady but laced with concern, "we've conducted extensive tests on the stones you brought back. We've discovered something alarming." Richard leaned forward, his heart racing. "What do you mean? What's wrong?" Dr. Harris took a deep breath. "The stones are not what we thought they were. They aren't mere mineral deposits. They are biological entities, an alien race that has been petrified for eons. We believe they were kept underground as a form of preservation. Richard's mind reeled. But that means the aliens we killed. They were sentient beings, Dr. Harris confirmed, her voice thick with regret. And now, with the stones exposed to our environment, they're starting to come to life. We don't fully understand how this is happening, but we're witnessing rapid cellular regeneration. They're awakening. The gravity of her words hit Richard like a punch to the gut. The very beings he had watched die at the hands of his fellow soldiers were now stirring back to life, and he felt responsible for the consequences that would follow. "How many are there?" he managed to ask, dread pooling in his stomach. Dr. Harris looked down, unable to meet his gaze. "We don't know yet, but initial estimates suggest they could multiply exponentially. We need to contain this before it spirals out of control." Panic surged through Richard as the reality of the situation sank in. "What do we do?" he asked, desperation creeping into his voice. "The only way to neutralize them is with the living DNA of the species," Dr. Harris replied, her voice trembling. "But with the extinction of their race, we're left with no means to stop what's coming." Richard's heart sank further. The knowledge that he had participated in the annihilation of an entire race loomed over him like a dark cloud. The scientists' frantic pace intensified. Their efforts to devise a plan to contain the awakening aliens felt futile. Days turned into a blur as reports poured in of strange occurrences across the globe. The first signs were subtle: a disturbance in the ecosystems, erratic weather patterns, and livestock behaving unusually. But then came the panic. Cities across the world reported mass sightings of grotesque, mutated forms emerging from underground caverns and abandoned structures. The creatures were nothing like the aliens Richard had encountered on Zeta 3. They had morphed into monstrous versions of their former selves, fueled by rage and vengeance. Reports of chaos flooded in, people screaming, cities falling into disarray, and the military struggling to contain the growing threat. It was a nightmare unfolding before Richard's eyes, and he felt helpless, paralyzed by the realization that his actions had set this disaster into motion. As the situation escalated, Richard's mind raced. He couldn't just stand by and watch as the world crumbled. He had to act. Driven by guilt and a sense of responsibility, he reached out to Dr. Harris and proposed a radical idea. They had to find a way to communicate with the newly awakened aliens, to understand them, and to seek a way to coexist or, at the very least, negotiate. Dr. Harris hesitated, but ultimately agreed, understanding that they had no other options. Together, they assembled a team of scientists and linguists, hoping to develop a way to communicate with the alien beings before it was too late. Richard felt a renewed sense of purpose. He needed to atone for the sins of the past and find a way to rectify the damage he had caused. As the world descended into chaos, Richard was determined to be a force for change, to seek understanding where there had been none. He believed that deep down there was still a chance for reconciliation. But time was running out, and the threat of extinction loomed larger every day. As he prepared for the daunting task ahead, he knew one thing. He would do everything in his power to save humanity from the monsters he had unwittingly unleashed. The world was on the brink of chaos, and Richard Brown found himself at the center of it all. The reports of the monstrous aliens flooding cities were relentless, painting a bleak picture of destruction and despair. His team, a group of brilliant but frightened scientists and linguists, struggled to decode the alien language, but hope was waning. As they gathered for yet another meeting, the atmosphere was thick with tension, and the flickering lights in the room mirrored their uncertain fate. Just as the team was preparing to concede defeat, Richard's mind raced back to the small green alien he had saved, the one who had evaded the wrath of his military comrades. It had been a fleeting thought, buried under layers of guilt and trauma, but now it resurfaced with a sense of urgency. "Wait," he blurted out, drawing all eyes to him. "What if we could find the alien child I saved on Zeta 3? Maybe it has the DNA we need to stop this madness." The room fell silent. The gravity of his words hung heavy in the air. Dr. Harris looked at him incredulously, her brow furrowed in concern. "You're serious? That's a long shot, Richard. We don't even know if it survived." "I know," Richard replied, his voice steady. "But if it did, it might hold the key to stopping the other aliens. We need to act fast before it's too late." Fueled by a renewed sense of purpose, Richard and his team reached out to the military to secure a spacecraft. The general, initially skeptical, eventually agreed to support the mission, recognizing the potential significance of Richard's proposal. "This might be our last chance," he said, a note of desperation creeping into his voice. "We can't afford to fail." The team prepared for the daunting journey back to Zeta 3, gathering all necessary equipment and supplies. Richard was torn between hope and fear. He knew that time was running out, and the risk of failure was immense. As they boarded the spacecraft, Richard felt a sense of determination wash over him. He was ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead, to confront the ghosts of his past, and to find a way to save humanity. The journey through the stars was both exhilarating and terrifying. The vastness of space enveloped them, a stark contrast to the chaos that awaited them back on Earth. As they approached Zeta 3, Richard's heart raced at the thought of seeing the alien child once more. He remembered its wide, fearful eyes and the innocence it embodied, a stark reminder of the lives he had inadvertently destroyed. Upon landing, the team swiftly made their way to the alien enclave where Richard had first encountered the small creature. The landscape was eerily quiet, a shadow of its former self. Richard felt a pang of regret as he walked through the desolate terrain, haunted by memories of the vibrant alien life that once thrived there. After a meticulous search, they found the small green alien huddled in a crevice, its frail form trembling with fear. Richard approached cautiously, his heart aching at the sight of the creature. "It's okay, little one. I'm here to help," he whispered, extending a hand. The alien stared at him, recognition flickering in its eyes. Slowly, it crawled toward him, and Richard carefully lifted it into his arms, cradling it as he had once done. With the alien child secured, the team rushed back to their spacecraft, their hearts pounding with anticipation. As they launched back toward Earth, Richard couldn't help but feel a glimmer of hope. Perhaps this time, they could make amends for their past mistakes. The team hurried to conduct tests, extracting DNA samples from the alien child. They believed they had finally found the solution to the chaos that had engulfed their planet. However, as the spacecraft entered Earth's atmosphere, an unforeseen disaster struck. The moment the green alien creature breathed in the Earth's oxygen, it began to change. Richard watched in horror as the alien's body contorted and expanded, its form shifting into something monstrous. The small creature that had once been so vulnerable transformed into a towering giant, its eyes now burning with rage. Panic erupted on the spacecraft as alarms blared and warning lights flashed. "What's happening?" Dr. Harris screamed, clutching her seat as the ship jolted violently. Richard realized too late that they had unleashed a new threat upon the world, a creature fueled by the very oxygen that had revived it. As they crash-landed on Earth, The newly transformed alien roared, a sound that reverberated through the air. Richard stumbled out of the wreckage, but the devastation that unfolded before him was beyond comprehension. The giant alien, with its immense power, wreaked havoc across the landscape, obliterating everything in its path. Richard's heart sank as he witnessed the destruction unfold. The military tried to combat the creature, but their efforts were futile against its overwhelming might. It tore through cities, reducing skyscrapers to rubble and leaving chaos in its wake. Richard could only watch in horror, as the world he had tried to protect crumbled before him. In the ensuing chaos, Richard saw familiar faces, friends, colleagues, and civilians, falling victim to the wrath of the giant alien. As he realized the consequences of his actions, a deep sense of despair washed over him. He had tried to save humanity, but instead, he had unleashed a nightmare that claimed lives indiscriminately. Amidst the destruction, the giant alien suddenly turned its gaze toward Richard. In that moment, he felt a chilling recognition. It spared him, its eyes reflecting a sense of understanding. It was as if the creature knew that Richard had once saved its life. But in that fleeting moment of empathy, Richard felt the weight of his guilt intensify. He had doomed the world, and now he stood alone, the last remnant of humanity. As the dust settled and silence fell over the ravaged landscape, Richard felt an overwhelming wave of sorrow wash over him. The weight of grief and guilt consumed him, as he realized he was now the last person left on Earth. The alien had left him alive, a cruel twist of fate that felt more like punishment than mercy. For 2 long years, Richard wandered through the desolation, grappling with the haunting memories of his choices. He visited the ruins of cities, the places where life once thrived, now echoing with silence. He mourned the loss of his friends, the innocent lives he had never known, and the alien race he had eradicated. In his solitude, Richard's spirit withered, burdened by the knowledge that he had brought this calamity upon the world. The weight of his actions became too much to bear, and he succumbed to despair. One fateful evening, as the sun set over the remnants of civilization, Richard sat beneath a skeletal tree, his heart heavy with sorrow. As the last light faded, Richard closed his eyes, allowing the tears to flow freely. He realized that he had lost everything: his friends, his purpose, and even the small glimmer of hope that had once driven him. In that moment, he understood that he would never escape the consequences of his choices. Richard Brown, once a celebrated astronaut, now a solitary figure in a desolate world, took his last breath, consumed by sadness. He had faced the truth of his actions, and in the end, he found no redemption, only the quiet acceptance of his fate.